Mary Ellen is a scientific and botanical illustrator, as well as an art educator. A former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. We're excited to have her with us today for drawing and painting orchids. So please welcome Mary Ellen. Woo!
So first, let's talk about the materials that we're going to be using today. So actually, let's talk about our subject first, and then we'll get into our materials. So our subject is the orchid, and it's a magnificent flower. It's difficult not to get excited about drawing orchids, and I highly recommend that you take the opportunity, if you're close enough, to go to the orchid exhibit that's currently on display at the Botanic Gardens. So the orchid that we're going to be focusing on today is the Phalaenopsis orchid. And Phalaenopsis is also called the moth orchid. This one is actually, I'm very fortunate. This time of year, my orchid collection seems to always have a major bloom. So our workshop is very, very timely. So let's talk a little bit about the orchid and things that are going to help us as an artist in order to draw the orchid with knowledge, draw it correctly, and also draw it with life about it and a sense of, and a real sense of individuality as well. Now, the first thing I want you to notice about the orchid is its perfect symmetry. Okay, it's obvious where it gets its name, right? The moth orchid, it actually resembles the wings of moths, the 2 petals that we have here. And then these 3 back here that look like petals are actually called sepals. And the sepals are, you can see on the back, they cover the petals. Okay, and so in some plants, they actually are the same color, and often in orchids, especially Phalaenopsis orchids, they are typically the same color or a similar color to the petals themselves. But in other plants, they have a greenish hue to them, and they tend to be a little bit thicker and a little more heavy duty because they actually protect the flower when the bud is closed. Now, 2 things that are very, very unique to orchids themselves are the column here and the labellum in this arrangement here. Now, you're going to notice that orchids have both the male and female parts of the flower. And so what they need is they need the pollinators to spread the pollen to the different flowers. And they are perfectly adapted to invite pollinators into the flower to pick up their pollen and carry it around. Now, one of the things that's also unique about orchids as well is that they have a variety of different species of orchids have a variety of different ways of attracting pollinators, by scent, by form, by color, and also the orchids have the unique aspect that some of them only attract a single species pollinator. The form is made completely to attract one specific kind of pollinator. So there gives you some basics about our flower. Now let's look at how we can take that knowledge and break that down in order to draw it well. So I'm going to set my live orchids aside, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my drawing board up here for us. Okay, and I'm going to check with Libby right now. Libby, is that all in focus for you?
Yep, it might just take a second, but it looks pretty good. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so let's get started. So, and as I said, this sheet, don't worry, I'm going to be posting this, okay, to my website. So you're going to have the opportunity to reference this in the future. Now, when we want to draw anything, the first thing that we want to look for is we want to look for something called axial relationships, okay? We want to look for how things align, and we want to look for symmetries that are going to help us. So let's look at our Phalaenopsis orchid that we have here. As I mentioned to you before, the orchid is symmetrical, and it's symmetrical about a vertical axis. So here's our vertical axis there that we have. So we're going to mark that for ourselves. And I'm going to explain this first, and then we're going to draw together. So, so then the next thing that we want to look for is we want to look for the overall shapes. Now, when I look at my orchid, okay, one of the things that I notice right away, and I'm going to give us a little more space there. There we go. And if at any time you're having a problem seeing, just make sure that you put a note in the chat, and Libby will make me aware, and we can make some adjustments for you. Now, the other thing I should note is we are going to be looking right now at the front view of our orchid. We're going to look at it in a few different views because, again, that helps us draw with some knowledge. So we're looking for that overall shape. And when we look at that overall shape of the orchid, you're going to notice that it fits within a perfect circle. Okay, so this is things to keep in mind while you're drawing. We want to take some time always to look at our subject carefully, to find these different relationships that are going on, so that when we pick up the pencil and we start to draw, we're able to draw with some real understanding of our subject. Now, the next thing that we look for is we look for shapes within shapes. And in this case, we have a wonderful isosceles triangle that our sepals actually set up for us. So the points of those are give us this nice isosceles triangle that works within that circle. Important thing to notice, though, the center of the circle, right at the column, okay, of the flower. So let's get one of our example flowers here. So here it is. So the center of that circle is right there, right at that center of that column, okay? But I want you to notice that just as in butterflies and moths, the part that earns its name as the moth orchid, these petals, these two petals that are attached to the column, they are not at a perfectly 180 degree. They're tipped up just like a moth's wings. Now, so now that we have these different relationships, these axial relationships, these overall shapes, the shapes within the shapes, now what we're going to look for is we're going to look for proportional relationships. So when we draw, you always want to make sure that you are measuring an object against itself. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do is I know, okay, from just observing these axial relationships and the shapes that that the sepals are actually all the same size, okay? So they are all pretty much the same size there and the same shape. So measure from here to here, this is all equidistant. Now, when I'm drawing my orchid, it doesn't matter if this is 1.5 inches or if it's 3/8 of an inch. What matters is that I notice that this length, and this length are all equal. We're going to pay attention to those different relationships of parts. The other thing that I'm going to be mentioning to you is the idea of drawing through. And you're going to notice that I'm drawing in very lightly the shape of those sepals, even though they are behind the petals. I want to make sure as an artist that I am aware of those shapes there. Okay, so then we're going to notice also that our petals are identical, right? They are the same shape here. Now I say that, and obviously in nature, we always have some variation going on. But when we get, those are things that you can pick up as you detail the drawing more. So I'm going to let it, I'm noticing it is behind. So I just drew the petals. And so I'm going to give it a moment to catch up, to bring in those other details. So now when we look at the column, when we see it in this view, it basically looks mostly circular, okay, with a little bit of almost like a tooth at the bottom, just like that. And then our labellum are just, they're very lovely. They tend to be very unique to each flower. This one, again, has this look of like wings. And again, often they tip up at the end. So we see a little bit of that. And we have the labellum just like that. And then this is kind of the lovely little invitation to the pollinator always. I mean, who wouldn't want to just sit inside of a flower? It's so beautiful like that. So this is our overall structure. When we think about this structure from the side, okay, we just want to remember that the flower itself is quite flat, okay, and it's actually tipped back a little bit from the labellum, so, and the column. So we tend to see the sepals are on the back. We still have a sense of that roundness of the circle. Okay, we still have that kind of roundness. But one of the things you're going to notice when we look at things in perspective, they tend to get compressed. So it's more compressed into an oval kind of shape like that. So here are our parts. I'm going to draw them in so you can kind of get this idea of what we're looking at. Now, you might think, oh my goodness, there's so much going on. But these are things that as you draw, before you draw, you want to just pay attention to. These are the things that you want to notice. What is that side view? What is that frontal view? What are those axial relationships? What are those overall shapes? Let's draw the flower together, okay? So now I have a couple of them that are already underway here, but we're going to draw one together, and I have my example here. Okay, I'm going to use this flower here, and I also can reference our real flower. Now, I highly recommend, if you have the opportunity to draw from life, that you do so. It's so important. There really is no substitute for drawing from life, and I'll tell you why. It's because you, as the artist, compose, the object on the page. You compose how you want the light to be on the subject, and you also edit. Part of artistic license and artistic vision is editing in and out the what you want in the work and what you want out of the work. So we're going to draw the phalaenopsis here. I'm probably going to put some color on it. I'm going to tip mine maybe just a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. So if you want to draw along with me now, this is a great opportunity to do that. I'm going to look at my object. Actually, I have a real advantage. I actually have my actual object here, so I can almost use it to lay things out. And you probably saw I even did a little cheat there where I'm going to take my
Yeah, and is it possible to zoom in a little bit on your paper so we can see your pencil drawings, or if you're showing us the orchid?
Yeah, I have the orchid right on top there. So here we go. So now what we're going to do is from here, I'm going to, again, I've got that big shape implied here. I may or may not draw in this circle completely, but what I definitely will have is this triangular shape, as I mentioned before, that I'm going to draw in. And in the center of my object, I'm going to put a little dot to remind me where the column is. So now I'm going to start drawing from back to front. I'm going to put in.
Mary Ellen, if you could push just a little bit harder on your pencil, just so we can see a little bit more, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Now, I should explain that one of the reasons I draw very lightly is because you typically draw lightly from the start in order to create a kind of skeletal drawing. And I'm measuring those parts against each other. And you want to draw lightly at first, mainly because you just don't want to put all that graphite on the page. I'm noticing where this comes in much closer than I've originally drawn it. So I'm going to bring that in here like this. And notice that I work side to side. That's what I highly recommend for you, is notice that I'm paying attention to there's this curve here. I want to make sure that these petals come out as far and what I do on the left, I go over immediately and do on the right. There's muscle memory involved. And so when you move back and forth between the two, I'm a little bit off there. Notice that I'm measuring as I go along. Now we have a drawing that is basically our orchid, just the basic details, just the basic forms. I'm sorry, not the details yet. Not there yet. Okay, so we have them like this. I'm going to pull this back. I'm going to make a few adjustments as I look at my orchid itself. Notice that I'm always moving back and forth. Now, you'll notice that I'm erasing as I go along. I'm erasing out some of those lighter construction lines. I don't want them to be part of my drawing. And now I'm going to erase out the lines that are from behind the orchid. Notice this one looks a little too long. I'm going to bring that in. You don't need to worry. I mean, it's pencil. You can make little adjustments. And now we have the basic shape of the flower. So we started, let's review again, okay? Especially for those of you who are new to drawing, I really like to emphasize the step-by-step nature of it. You know, we go ahead and get that axial relationship, tip these up a little. We know we have that center of the flower. There is a large circle that's implied around the flower. And then this triangular, that triangular shape within a shape there for our flower. And when we take the flower and we break it down to kind of bite-sized pieces like this, it's so much easier. Now, let's get in that beautiful column and labellum. Now, if you look carefully, one of the things that I was fascinated to notice is that the labellum and the column are actually all the same. They're actually all the same form. They come right off of the column, the petal here, and then the labellum comes down. And so when we know that, that really makes a difference in how we draw. So I'm going to go ahead, and since this is a frontal view, I'm going to see that column, but I've noticed there's a little bit of perspective involved here. So there's almost like a little nose, kind of comes down here, widens out a little bit, and we have that, just that little bit, that little tip that hangs down that we see. And then I'm going to start putting in the back part of the labellum is what I see there, just beautiful. Then this interior structure that holds the pollen. And again, I'm going to, this curve inside the flower there is symmetrical. So I'm going to make sure that I draw that. And now I'm going to draw the petals, or I'm sorry, I'm going to draw, there's two sides here that are overlapping on the petals. But notice we've got just a little bit of this folds forward. So I'll erase some of this out so it's not too confusing. And this area here, I want you to think of it as like a flat triangle, like almost like a diamond shape here. And then we have a situation that can be really confusing. Sometimes this is the foreshortening. Notice that what's happening is this portion of the flower is coming up and it's curling up and it's in front of us. Don't be intimidated by that. Just draw what you see. And what you see is, when I'm looking at this, is this narrows down. It appears, for the most part, pretty flat. And then I see this structure come up like this, and it's perfectly symmetrical on the other side. And I bring it out, and look, you captured the foreshortening right there. Right like that. So now we have our basic orchid. So this is our line drawing. Now, that's all well and fine, but in order to make a line drawing really come to life, really describe the dimensionality of something, we're going to need to think about value. So let's go back now to our construction drawings here that we have, and let's think about value just a little bit. I'm going to put my orchid back in the water, and I'm going to grab my pen here. And so what I want you to imagine, here we have our orchid, okay, just as we've drawn it. And for those of you who are still drawing, still working on your pencil drawing, this is going to give you a chance. You just keep drawing. And this is going to give you a little chance to catch up before we start putting the value on our drawing. So we did those basic shapes. We've got our drawing for the most part in proportion. You're probably starting to notice now how different species of orchids have the petals, the column, the labellum, all slightly different forms. And now when we draw, it's best to have a single light source. It's not always possible. And if you can imagine that single light source, what would the shadows be if the light source was from the upper left-hand corner? Now, that's for my right-handed folks. If you are a left-handed person, you want to imagine the light source from the other side, from the right-handed side. Now, that's a little bit of fun for you, okay? Because next time you go to an art museum, what I'd like you to do is go to the section where they have traditional still lifes from, say, the Dutch in the 16th century, or even portraiture from the 17th through 19th century. And you'll be able to find the left-handed artists. The left-handed artists are the ones whose shadows are all on the left-handed side. The light is coming from the right. And the right-handed artists tend to be the ones the light source is coming from the left. It's kind of fun to think of it that way. Now, if this is the case, now remember, the sepals are behind the petals. So we know that we are going to have a shadow here, right? We're going to have shadows down here. And in the interior, we're also going to have a shadow cast here. And of course, this whole structure will be casting a shadow onto the sepals behind. Now, this is for the flower itself. Always think about when you're drawing that you want to, excuse me for one moment here, mislaid a pen. There we go. You always want to consider.
Mary Ellen, we can't quite see what you're writing up there. You just put on, thank you.
Thank you. So you always want to consider a simple lighting situation. And as I mentioned before, you always want to begin with these really simple shapes. So imagine a sphere. So if we have our sphere, we're going to have a lighted side, okay? And we're going to have a darker side. We're also going to have a cast shadow on our sphere. Now, a couple of things that are important to remember. As a rounded surface or any surface turns away from the light, you end up getting what's called a turning shadow. And that turning shadow is what really gives that illusion of roundness. Now, cast shadows, this is when one object casts a shadow onto another. And in this case, with our little sphere, we have a ground plane. It's always darkest closest to the object. And then as it moves away and gets to the edges, it softens out. So when you're confused about shadows, come back to the sphere and remember the cast shadow is dark closest to the object and fades as it goes to the edges and moves away from the object. Remember the turning shadow as the object turns away. And then last but certainly not least, remember this. This is the reflected light. The reflected light is the light that actually bounces off of the surface behind the object, and in this case, in the ground plane, and it reflects some light back onto the object. This is what makes it look round. So we've had a chance now to think about, this is the cartoon of our shadows, right? This is the subtle principle of how our shadows works. So now let's go back to our drawing. Now, as I do that, I'm going to ask you, Libby, do we have any questions?
We actually just got one question, and that is, what number pencil are you using right now?
Right now, okay, I am using a 4B pencil. And now that gives us an opportunity to talk about pencils a little bit. Now, typically, I draw with a 2H pencil because I love to do watercolor. And the reason that I do, I use the 2H is because the difference between a 4B and a 2H pencil is the amount of binder that is mixed in with the graphite and the clay. So each pencil consists of 3 components: binder, graphite, and clay. The more binder I put in, and think of binder as glue, the harder the pencil is, which means the lighter the line it will make. So whenever you're thinking of an H pencil, think to yourself, hard. So this is going to, the H pencil is going to make the lighter line. And you can even see that here. In this example right here, this is drawn completely with a 2H pencil, the flower just above. And the pencil that I've been using as we're drawing, in order to get that nice contrast so you can see it in our digital media here, I'm drawing with the 4B pencil. Now, the other difference between these two pencils and the way that they behave is that the H pencil, not only do I have lighter lines and lighter values with it, and we can see that example. I'm going to do that right up here in the corner. I'm going to bear down. Here's my darkest dark with my 2H pencil, and then I'm going to just blend that out to make a little value scale for myself. And you're going to notice it's a series of very subtle grays. Even the darkest dark is a soft gray. Now, as opposed to the 4B pencil, and you're going to notice right away, my darkest dark is significantly, I'm going to move down there so you can see that, significantly darker. And then as I move down, I have a darker value scale in general. So this is the 4B compared to the 2H. Okay, and don't worry, all of these will be on my website afterward, all the examples. So when you buy a new pencil, one of the things I like to recommend is that you actually do this, you know, see how dark it is. Now, why I would use one as opposed to the other is my intentions for this drawing here, and I'm going to move out gently, okay? My intentions for the drawing that I've started here is that I will watercolor this. So I want to have a pencil that leaves less loose graphite onto my page. Now, if I'm sketching though, and I really just want to capture the form of the object, and I really want to get value down quickly, then I want a pencil like the B pencil that's going to leave a lot more graphite with a lot less pressure and a lot faster. So does that make sense? I hope it does.
Yes, it definitely makes sense. And then just a heads up for you, we're at about 11:15, and
Okay.
you wanted a time check around that time for shifting into watercolors.
Okay.
And we did get another question too about if you ever use a mechanical pencil.
Oh, a mechanical pencil. If you're comfortable with that, by all means. You can use you can actually buy different leads for the mechanical pencil. You can use that. The main thing to get yourself out of the habit of, if it is a problem for you, and it was for me when I first started drawing is I was naturally a heavy-handed person, which meant that I really held my pencil very tight and I would bear down on the paper, which actually would score the paper, leaving like little valleys, where I would leave lines. So when I would erase, it was impossible for me to erase completely, because there was always that little divot that I left in the surface of the paper. Now, how did I get out of the habit of that? Well, two ways. The first one is just very consciously lightened up. And the second way is I did what folks talk about, and you'll hear this very much in life drawing classes. They will tell you to draw from your shoulder and from your elbow, and less tightening up, holding that pencil like that. Keep it loose, keep it easy, keep that wrist loose, and that's really going to help you with that. Mechanical pencils help a great deal with that, because the lead is much more fragile, and it also will not, it won't tolerate a lot of pressure. So if you are heavy-handed, I actually recommend the mechanical pencil. It will get you out of the habit very quickly. So now let's get back to just putting down some basic values so we finish up our sketch here. Okay, so now what I have here, and remember, whatever pencil you started with today, you are absolutely fine. Okay, we're going to be fine because we can watercolor over a sketch with 4B just as we can with the 2H. It's just that we have to be a little bit careful about using a lot of, about working in the areas where there's a lot of graphite. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn off one of my lights. Okay, and so now you're going to notice that I have a very distinctive, and let me pull up just a little bit. All right, there we go. Now you're going to notice that I have some really nice shadows on my petal. I need to get my thumb out of the way. There we go. So now I have these lovely shadows. And so what I'm going to do, once again, I'm going to start to draw the shape of those shadows. And I'm going to do that very lightly, just as we've done before. I like to start with the shape. Okay. I know that this is going to be dark. I know that I have a shadow here, and I have a very distinctive shadow here as well. Now, the other thing that's really nice about when you're drawing, when you're putting in the shadows, is this is an opportunity for you to pick up the individuality of the flower. So as I'm noticing these different shapes here, notice I'm keeping that very, very light. I notice that I have a little bit of value here, a little bit of value here I need to put in, and some down here. And I'm going to zoom down so you can see what I did. Okay, so you can see those light shapes that are in there. And then I'm going to begin to shade in those areas. I'm keeping them, these are going to be a much lighter value up here, because they're actually on the petal. I notice too, there's a little bit of value here. I'm going to turn my other light on so you can see my work. But notice that I keep my value lines, I like to say, boring. They're very consistent. There's nothing exciting or interesting about these lines. And when I put them on the petals themselves, I tend to follow that. You're going to notice there's like a subtle, almost veining of in the flesh of the flower, and I follow that to give it some texture. But when it comes to putting in the shadows themselves, I keep those lines very dull, very uninteresting. We want people to look at the shadow. We don't want them to look at interesting squiggly lines. And you'll notice if I do a series of lines like this, those are really fascinating. I want to look at that. But if I do a series of lines like that, I tend to look at just the value. So that's why you want to make sure that when you do these lines, you keep it very, very subtle. And I'm using my finger today to do a little bit of blending. I'm going to soften down those edges. Might even use my pencil. I could also use a paper stump. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay attention to where my darkest darks are. I'm going to come in, I'm going to start, because there, it's not all just the same shade of gray. There's going to be a little value in here, just a bit. Get that lovely roundness in that interior. And then I'm going to put a little turning shadow on the nose of that column there. Just the littlest bit. And I'm going to darken down right behind it there to make that pop, to make it come forward. Because when we create a point of contrast, then we create some visual interest, and then people want to look in that particular spot. So as artists, we want to pay attention to where we create contrast, because that's where the viewer's eye is going to look. And remember, you know, when you're drawing, there's something wonderfully intimate about drawing, because you're inviting someone into your vision. You're inviting them into your world, you know, what you saw and what you want to celebrate. So there's our drawing. It's coming along quite nicely. We want to put a little bit of a turning shadow here, right? Because if our light is coming down, it's going to hit on these little tips. I think these lines are a little hard, and I want these little tips to come forward. And since I'm using a soft pencil, one of the somewhat disadvantages of that is that we need to sharpen up pretty often to make sure that we can get that detail that we want to get.
Mary Ellen?
Yes.
We had a question about if you actually put the shadows in with pencil when you're going to use the drawing to paint on as well.
Oh, that's a great question. Now, yes, you can do that. And actually today I'm going to show you both ways that we can work that. You can do it, and you can choose to not do it. And as I said, if you do put the shadows in, generally you want to use, that's where you want to use the number 2, the 2H pencil. Rather than this pencil, you can see how easily and beautifully you can get just these subtle values, because there's very, very little binder in this pencil. Now, and so I will show you both ways. And as a matter of fact, that's why I have this one prepared up here and this one without the shadows. So we'll talk about that, and we can look at both of those techniques.
And it is 11:24, just so you know.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I'm going to take us to 11:30, because what I want to do is I want to show folks, I know we often think to ourselves, oh, you know, all of our art supplies are sort of sacred, but I'm going to do something that's going to seem horrifying to some folks. I'm actually going to take my eraser here, because I'm finding this shape. I need a little bit of a sharp edge here. So I took my X-Acto knife and I cut off a portion of my white eraser here. And this is so I have this nice edge here, and I can come in and begin to pluck out little highlights. And I can get, and since I have that, you know, we often think of drawing only as an additive technique, but it's actually additive and subtractive. We can come in with and remove some of the graphite, and that way we get that really subtle, this really subtle and broad range of values with that. Now, last but not least, on our drawing portion here, oh, you can see, look at that. I still have a construction line in there. I'm going to take that out. Okay, and I'm going to pluck out a little highlight up here. That was fun. Okay, I'm going to soften this down. I think I got a little enthusiastic there.
Mary Ellen, as you're erasing here, are there any differences in shading for people who might be left-handed?
You know, the only thing is that, as I said, if you want to change the value, because you'll notice as I'm right-handed, okay, I'm moving into my shadows, you know, or I'm moving away from my shadows. I create them and then I can move my hand back from them. If you're left-handed and you try to do that, right, you're always kind of, it feels backwards to you. So you should do what feels normal to you. And typically my left-handed students tell me it's a lot easier to have those shadows going the opposite way that I draw them. Now, you're going to notice, too, I'm doing something now. This is the fun part with drawings, I think. Not only am I picking out kind of the individuality of the flower and trying to get in like little subtleties and things, but notice that I'm taking some of this strong line away. And I'm creating what's called lost and found line, okay? Now, it's a little bit like somebody tells you a story and they feel compelled to tell you every single detail that happened rather than kind of letting you sort of fill in, you know, the things. This happens in movies sometimes. It's very frustrating in movies. Like if they tell you everything, there's no subtlety to it and it's less engaging. And this way, our eye has the opportunity to sort of jump from one interesting point to another point, to another point, to another point, because we love to follow that little rhythm of darks and lights and create a broad value range there. The other thing that you want to do too is think about how, flying eraser, I think I might put in a little turn there. And we could just spend the rest of the time having fun detailing out this drawing, but then I wouldn't have a chance to show you some watercolor. So let me do that. Okay, I'm going to put in, you'll notice I'm putting in some of those stronger shadows like that. Oh, hey, that might have got a little heavy-handed there. There we go. And it's okay if you lose some of the detail. It doesn't have to be a scientific illustration. Okay, I might soften some of that up. Now, let's start thinking about painting. Let me pull out a little bit here. Now, you can definitely see the difference between this is in 4B, okay? And I'll label this so that when I take a picture of all of these and put them on my website, you'll have them as a reference. So here's our sketch in the 4B, and here's our sketch up here in the 2H, and you'll notice it's much softer. Now this one here, okay, as you're getting your watercolors out, this one here, you will notice, and I'm going to zoom down here, you're going to notice that I have pretty much all of my values in here, okay? And what I've used is, I have used this photograph that we had on the website as a reference. Now over here, you're going to notice what I have done is I have just drawn in those shapes, and I started to do a little blending here, but I'm going to take that out, and I'm just going to keep where those shapes of those different darks are. I'm going to have some there and some there. And so I have my shadows on this portion. I know where they are, and I'm going to keep those. I'm making them darker than I normally would. I would have them so that I could barely see that distinction in here. I really wouldn't want to see any of that because watercolor is a transparent medium, and I don't want to see a lot of my guidelines if I can help it. Okay, so we've got one here ready with value, okay, and we've got the other one that does not have the value on it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to I'm going to paint this in such a way that I'm going to be able to show you a different technique that you can employ, because for most of our orchids, okay, they have some kind of patterning on them, and we want to make sure that you are able to conquer that. Sorry about that. All right, just moving some things around here as I'm getting my watercolors out, probably like you're doing, moving things around. And now my watercolor palette, I'm going to show that to you really quickly, is very messy. But just so you can see, this is a palette, and actually my palette is very pathetic. It's even broken, but I like this palette so much that I still keep it. This is it's a plastic palette that I bought years ago. You're going to notice that one of the things that I do, if you can see at all through here, that I actually label all of my pigments. And this is because I buy tube pigments that are made by various different manufacturers. And I have preferences for the pigments that certain manufacturers use. So I make note to myself about which ones are which, so that when I run out, I know exactly. And I do this with a Sharpie marker. And I do this, and then that way I'll know which color I need to use to replace it with. But if you have pan watercolors, that is perfectly fine. You can use those, and they're going to work great for you. Now, one of the things that I do right away is I start by mixing what my palette is going to be. I want to decide what my palette is going to be. And for these two orchids here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a cadmium yellow as our base. Okay, so that's going to be our base there, the cad yellow, and I will write that down. So once again, you will have this. So this is our cadmium yellow. All right, and we're going to do some nice accents with it and we're going to use, this is going to be a permanent magenta that we're going to use with it. Okay. Okay, we've got that. Now, The other thing that we need to think about is we need to think about what our shadows are going to be. Now, it's very important. Yeah, you very seldom need to use black when you're painting with watercolor. What you do to make the shadow is you mix the opposite, okay? And on the color wheel, okay, the opposite of our of yellow, okay, is actually violet. So, which is very convenient because it's kind of related, the violet is kind of related to our magenta. So that's our shadow color. Now, I know you might be looking at that and you think, oh, that is a god-awful color. Well, it isn't a very attractive color, but it's going to be in the shadows. And now, since I'm looking at this and I'm finding that this is a bit warmer, okay, I'm not too happy with that. So I'm going to take my cad yellow again, and I'm going to see, what if I just mix it with the permanent magenta? That's a much...
Mary Ellen, can
Yes.
you zoom in a little bit to those areas where you're blending those colors? Because we can't quite see.
There we go.
Yeah. And if you can get in just a little bit tighter, that's awesome. And we don't see the far right one yet.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So you're going to see that you're going to get a color that is more in keeping with the palette itself. Now, if it also appears to be too warm to you, one of the things you can do is you can add a color that is a personal favorite of mine. You can add just a touch of, this is Davy's Gray, okay? And this cools down the color. You could also add a little bit of nope, that's not going to work. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the Davy's Gray, and that's going to help us. That's a little bit too much. And because when we're doing the shadow color, you always want to make sure, if you're thinking about it like almost as a recipe, that it's going to be 1 part for the cool color and 2 parts for the other colors, and that's going to be our shadow color. So that is the cad yellow with the magenta, and then this is called Davy's Gray. You can also use an ultramarine blue, but this is a cooler, darker blue that I put in there. And that's going to be our shadow color. Okay, so let's go ahead and get painting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is, remember, watercolor is a translucent medium, which is fantastic. And so I am actually just going to paint my yellow on top here. This is my base color. This is the color that is underneath everything. And because I know,
do you want to zoom in sort of to the area that you're actually painting? That would be great.
Of course.
Thank you.
Now you're going to notice that you can see my shadows underneath here. Okay. And that's fine. I'm taking advantage of that translucent medium. You'll also notice that I am avoiding the column and labellum. That is because they have white in them. And I do not want the white. I don't want to lose the white. In watercolor, we keep the white. We save it. And you'll notice too that I'm coming back in with my brush is a little bit drier and it's clean, and I'm lifting out some of the yellow in some places so that we're already getting a little bit of value movement. I'm going to put a little touch in here.
Mary Ellen, as you're painting, is it okay if people are painting on their drawing paper? I think some people started their sketches on drawing paper instead of watercolor paper. Is that okay?
It's fine. It's going to buckle a little. Buckling by mean it's going to get little hills and valleys in it. What I'm going to recommend that you do is after we're finished here today and you're finished painting, put it between two paper towels. Put it between 2 or 3 paper towels and put it under a heavy book, and then it's going to dry nice and flat for you, and you won't be disappointed.
Awesome. And as you're dabbing the water out of your paintbrush, are you using a tissue or how are you doing that?
I actually use either a piece of felt, or I also use I'm really fond of paper dinner napkins. They work really, really well. Also, another thing that works really well are shop towels. If you have the heavy duty paper towels, those are really good to use too. So now we have like this basic color. So now I'm gonna I notice this is the one that I'm working from. Okay, this one's on the website there. I'm gonna add a little bit. I'm going to be mixing on my palette here. I'm going to mix a little bit of this with my cad yellow and put a little more cadmium yellow. I want this to be a little lighter. There we go. And I'm going to come in on some of these edges here. Okay, I'm going to add. I'm looking at the flower. I'm trying to mimic the patterning that I see. Okay, I might even put in a little areas where it's a little bit dark. Put it in there. And now I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm going to daub it so it's not quite so wet. And I'm going to work that edge just a little. I'm going to soften those edges down. Don't want it to dry with a big hard line there. Okay. Come in like that. That was a funny little edge there. I'm going to take that out.
Marielle, the color that you're currently using, that's a blend of the cad yellow and the magenta?
And the magenta, it is.
And then what sort of brush are you using right now?
This is a number 6 round. And with this, and the number 6 round, I apologize sometimes, especially for those of you who are just joining us for the first time. I have a lot more information on my website to talk specifically about brushes and things like that. But the number 6, you're going to see it gives a nice tip to it, a really nice pointy tip, but I also can bear down and get a wider area as well in order to get some nice coverage there. So I find the 6 to be a really, like a good size, a kind of happy medium. Okay, now I'm going to leave that alone, all right? Sometimes watercolor is what I like to call a hurry up and wait medium because you have to sort of hurry along to get it to do what you want it to do, so it dries just as with the effect that you want it to do. And then you have to wait for it to dry because the details that I'm going to put in here, if I do them now, it might be a little too wet for it, and I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is, in the meantime, I'm going to go over here, okay, and we're going to do exactly the same thing as we started, but this time I'm going to work the shadows in, okay, while by using those shapes, you're going to see I'm working in big gestures right now, getting that base color down. It's all the cadmium yellow. Yeah, see, there's where the tip of that brush is really helpful when I'm trying to work around a little detail like that. And you'll notice too, I overshot there a little bit, so I can lift that out. When your brush is clean and dry, it works like a sponge. And then when it's wet and filled with pigment, it works like a mop. And the tip of that number 6 is super helpful because it allows me to get into these tight little areas. Now everything is quite wet right now, and I'm going to come in with the mix of the magenta. I'm going to let a little bit of this blooming is desirable. Okay, I'm going to come back and do a little more control in just a moment. I'm going to let it bloom a little bit and come in here because I want to keep that little tip there. Lovely. And I'm going to come in now. My brush is clean and damp. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of controlling where that darker value went. You'll notice I'm actually pushing the pigment around a little bit. And I'm taking away those hard edges because, as I mentioned to you in the little demonstration with our sphere, you know, we don't have hard edge shadows unless we have an extraordinary lighting situation where we have really hard edge, you know, like theatrical lighting. We don't really, they're always a little bit softer. There we go. There we go. Quite fun. And I'm going to come in here, and this is where we can see the petals just a little bit in the background there. Oh, looks like I've got a little piece of fuzz. I'm going to have to try to take that out. Now, when that happens, it's inevitable. Oh, I got lucky. I got it out. If it seems too fussy to get like a piece of fuzz or a stray bristle off, I recommend that you just wait till it dries just a tad. So there we go. Oh, that's fun. And I think I'm gonna let that go. So you can see the difference now between the two flowers, how I approach now. I'm letting this value show through, and it has a cooler effect than over here. Now I can come in and I can do a little more value in these areas here because I want them to work together. So I'm going to do that, kind of catch this one up, and I'm working right over my pencil drawing at this point. While that other one is drying there. There we go. And I'll work back into that. There we go. And they're a little more even in color and tone this time. Now, let's talk about how we're going to let those, this one is pretty much ready to go. Let's talk about how we're going to get in that patterning. This one is just a little bit damp. That's a good thing. I'm going to come in with my permanent magenta, and I've got the tip of my brush, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to literally start to make little dots. And if they bleed, that's perfectly fine, because you're going to notice that that's actually what happens on the flower itself. You come in, there's a lot of magenta down in this area here. And I'll just continue with those little spots and adding that magenta in. And you're going to notice that they do have a logic to them. They have a pattern. And I'm going to try to capture that pattern. As we go along here. So I'm going to leave that. Okay, I'm liking that, like how nice and loose that is. And because I'm afraid about our time a little bit, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to work with the column and the labellum area here, so you get a chance to see how I would approach that. And so now there's a very dark magenta in the back here. I'm going to take that. I'm going to let it be a little bit darker up there in the interior. And as I pull it out, pull the pigment out, I'm just going to use more water so that I get a natural progression with the value. Going from very dark to much lighter. And these little tips here are very, very light. So I'm actually going to be working around them. Just get that little bit of an underside there. And then you'll be able to see. Now, this portion up here, we're going to have to put a little bit of shadow in there. And this time, I'm going to be adding a little more of, I'm putting in that Davies gray this time, because I want to get just a bit there on that. And I'm going to, there we go. Just get a little bit, notice I'm keeping that turning shadow. And I'm creating some contrast right underneath that with a darker value. Remember, I'm only mixing 3 colors. If you're mixing more than 3 colors, the odds are you're overdoing. You need to simplify it. There we go. I'm going to bring this down here. Oh, looks like I lost a little there. And we're working in to get that. Now, the area where the pollen is, even though it is white, I'm going to put just a little bit of value on it because it's back in the shadow there. So I'm just going to make sure there's a little bit of value there. And you probably noticed I overshot on that one part. I'm glad I did that, because a lot of times we think, oh no, I overpainted and now it's ruined. But really just give it a moment, take a breath, and then come in with a clean paintbrush and pull out the portion, the undesired portion. There you go. And I'm going to put a little value on those and there. And now is the fun part. Now's the part we're going to go in and we're going to add little bits of, just darken down the shadows in certain areas here. Not a lot. That looked like a lot when I first put it down, but you're going to notice I'm going to push it back up tight, close to that interior of the flower, and then we got like a nice cast shadow there. Let's go ahead and this one's probably ready. We can go ahead and start to put in some of this. Now this is quite dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a bunch of the permanent magenta here. Okay, and then I'm going to come in with a very wet brush and blend water into that. Make that all wet. And now I'm going to come back in with the permanent magenta again and start to put in put in the dots. Now, don't overwork the dots. It's painting's like poetry. It's, you know, it's not how many words, it's the right words. So always kind of remind yourself of that. And then in some areas here, we can come back in and make this much darker if we'd like. I'm going to put a little bit down here, a few here. Since those petals are in the background, I'm not going to fuss too much over them. I'm going to take some permanent magenta and then just with a little bit of water, okay, because I want it to be really light. I want to make sure that, again, even though this is white, I still want to have a little bit of that pinkish hue on there with that. So, Libby, how are we for questions?
I think everybody is working and maybe not doing as much questioning right now. But if people
Okay,
have questions, they can post them in the chat. We have about 4 minutes left in the class, so yeah.
And this was a marathon class, so this was not easy to conquer. It's a complicated subject. And we did drawing and painting in an hour and a half. And I have to be honest with you. So I want to give you a little sense of reality about this, is that I would normally, for such a painting like this, I would probably, especially if I was going to do the entire work here, I would probably take at least 2 hours. If not 2.5 to 3 to do this. So you've put forth a heroic effort this afternoon. And I will say, here is, I'll put a little bit of paint on, this is the 4B. And one of the things you're going to notice is I'm going to tend to work with more. I promised to do this, so I want to make sure I did this for those of you who are working on drawing paper and you're using a soft pencil. I'm being very careful not to overwork those areas that have lots of pencil on it. I don't want to do too many brush strokes on top of that, because I don't want to make the graphite start to float and move it around, and then then it will start to kind of just end up being very, very muddy. So I don't want to do that. So that's actually how I did that. So you can see in that area there. So, okay. So I think we're at a bit of a stopping point here. I'm going to keep that there. Let me zoom down a little bit so folks can see that. And you can see my palette nicely. I really was only using this color, and this color here. So it was only the 3 colors. And if I'm unhappy with an area, I can go in again, as I mentioned, after it's dry, and just gently with a wet, clean brush, pick up some of the pigment in some areas. Now, that being said, I do want you to keep in mind that there are pigments that stain more than others. So some pigments will, like cadmium yellow, will practically, it'll be completely gone. You can pick it up almost to pure white again. As you can imagine, the purple is going to be a little more fussy about that. That's going to be a little more difficult to remove that. And you'll notice that I'm going in, and in order to create that sense of depth, I'm adding little bits of that darker value, which I've taken the purple and I've mixed it with some of that blue, that Davies gray. It's a blue-gray to get that sense of depth into the flower. And remember, you can keep these areas loose. You don't have to go in and get every little grain of pollen. I know that's one of the parts that can feel really, really overwhelming about orchids. But just giving a sense of the structures that are there keeps you from, making that mistake of being too literal with your painting. Again, you want it to be like poetry. It's fun when we're asked to participate and we asked to fill in the gaps.
And Marilyn, just so you know, we're right at noon. So I just wanted to thank everybody who joined us today. We really appreciated them coming in, and as you're still continuing to paint, that's fantastic. But really want to thank everyone for joining us, and also thank you, Mary Ellen, for your time today. So yeah, getting lots of love in the chat, and appreciate everybody's patience today, and thank you so much.